and welcome to an interview episode with the Arts Management and Technology Lab. My name is Alyssa, and I am the podcast producer. In this episode, we sit down with Elliot Mower of Doberman and Rachael Wilkinson of Rachael. Both are two arts managers gone tech, and both are here to discuss workplace trends and what one career field can pick up from the other. This episode is divided into two parts, with this episode featuring the value of failure. We hope you enjoyed the concluding half of this interview, brought to you by AntLab. So we're going to go ahead and hop into the second part of the episode. We're going to continue where we left off, and that is the topic of encouraging failure in the workplace. Starting with Elliot this time, can you give us a specific example of what it means to encourage failure in the workspace?
Yeah, I think we're pretty focused on the idea that we should try to avoid failure at all costs. And I would say that that's a pretty noble pursuit. But I think the reality of life is that we learn the most when we do fail. And I think being open and honest about accepting that part of life into your professional process puts you at a much greater advantage to like evolve your career and your sense of self and progress if you just understand that you're not always going to knock it out of the park all the time. I actually had a job interview last year for a weird job with a pretty big fintech company. And the interviewer asked me to tell her about a time when something that I was working on failed. And like what projects that I had put out into the world didn't go as I had intended. And it's hard for me to imagine that that's a question that you would be asked in the arts, that you would honestly and earnestly be asked, when was a time that you were working on something and it totally did not go as you intended? And what did you do and how did you learn? So I think it's a super important part of just understanding how we operate as people, and accepting that just puts us in a much better place.
It's kind of amazing because I had a very similar conversation actually in my interview for this particular role. I had a sort of introduction lunch with the whole team and then a second conversation with our founder, CEO. And at some point during that second conversation, he said something to me like, well, at some point you're going to make the wrong call. Like, you're going to fail. Like, your role here is going to be prioritization and like helping guide product, and you're just not always going to be right. And for me, that was so incredibly freeing, right? Like, if you take failure as this certainty that like the whole team is ready to accept, like everyone is on board with the fact that we're not going to make it 100% of the time. Imagine what a secure team you can create and what a wonderful culture you can build. And people can actually feel like they are open to collaboration and putting their ideas forward and talking about things, before they're ready to ship or before they absolutely need an answer. It's that mindset that says like, I'm blocked on this thing, but it's not a failure that I haven't solved it yet because I just need some support in solving it.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely love that because, sometimes when I ask people to define failure, they put it as maybe when you fall short on a task or when you cannot deliver everything that you need to a client. But, Rachael, when we spoke beforehand, you also described failure as like part of the tech rule to move fast and break things and really have the freedom to do that. Or is there perhaps like even more to it than what we might expect?
Yeah, that's the old Facebook motto, right? Move fast and break things.
Like democracy.
Like democracy. But no, and I think this goes back to our first half of our conversation where we were talking about what Agile can do in the world of project management. And that idea of having people who are flexible and literally agile and sort of unafraid to break the stuff in order to find the better solution is to like free your some cost fallacy, right? And you can really focus on delivering that product that is absolutely perfect for your client.
So what would you perhaps suggest for retraining for the arts management model, or maybe a additional model with any other sort of organization and company to make everybody a lot more comfortable with failure?
Yeah, I think it does get back to what we were talking about on the previous episode about having a lot of comfort with from leadership of the organization to let you try things and to be comfortable with failure. And I think that's a pretty non-traditional. I don't think that that's a comfortable space for most traditional organizations. I think that for the most part, people want to make an investment, whether that's money or time or what have you, in something that they're confident is not going to fail. So you have to kind of take baby steps to shift your mindset to like lead in the invest. I was very fortunate to have a great boss, Lou Castelli, who's now the managing director there. But at the time, he was director of external affairs or marketing, and he gave me and my coworker, Katie Conaway, the opportunity to try things that really would have been non-traditional, I guess, audience engagement and sort of audience development events that were not in the traditional theater model. We were allowed to experiment with those things, and we were allowed to have those things not go over super well, but we were also not really given a budget. So it was like, what could you do with $50, or what could you do with $200? And we were comfortable with failing with that limited investment. We were also comfortable, like, if we could turn $50 into bringing 10 new people into the theater, that investment was pretty significant. So I think it's, having somebody who is going to advocate for you to really try and experiment, understanding that those things may not always succeed, but that person has to be in a position of executive leadership.
Right. And I feel like what makes that example work is that monetary investment is one thing, right? But it's also making the investment of staff time, which I feel like small organizations are not always able to do. I have sort of a similar experiment when I was at Studio, where we played around with Bluetooth beacon technology, and trying to message patrons either before or after their show while they were in the physical space. And you can buy a beacon for maybe $100. It's a super low investment, but the time investment of actually trying to figure it out, and seeing and evaluating how your patrons are reacting to it, that's a huge ask. And having leadership that is comfortable with saying, like, yes, you can spend your time playing with this new thing, is so important. And I think that, to go back to like, what can the arts learn from tech or vice versa? A lot of tech companies very famously have staff time dedicated to experimental projects, right? Like, you have to use 25%. And, when you're in an organization where maybe you don't have the budget to play around with that much, how can you actually create that time in that space to play with something that's cool and new? And to your point exactly, Elliot, like, that sort of decision making has to come from the top of the tree. And if you don't have leadership in it, like, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah. For this next question, actually, this is really an example that when I think of leadership buy-in and the value of failure, I think of this one particular famous case where, according to Robinson Meyer of The Atlantic, there's one team in particular that actually helps to rebuild healthcare.org when it first rolled out. A couple of interesting highlights within that article is that within a program, there's always going to be bugs. So rather than building something that's perfect, you need to build something that simply works. And another direct quote from that article is that catastrophic failure became a regular occurrence. And it was interesting because there was another story of this particular leader within this team where every time a team member actually failed, they would even encourage applause from the rest of the team if possible. So, a leader hearing this might be hesitant to this idea of failure and, find it absolutely terrifying. So what do you suppose would be the answer to convincing them that this idea of failure is something that more organizations should pick up on?
Well, healthcare.gov is always a good example of what not to do that I think we're still sort of recovering from as a country, because it failed so catastrophically that it became like a watchword for failure. It became like, I have described websites that I've been a part of that I know are not going to do well as healthcare.gov. It becomes the sort of great adjective of bad actions. But I think that the idea of applauding somebody for failure, I think about the things that it's always this trope in like invention and innovation that when you set out to do something and something else happens, that's when when they intended to create post-it notes, or when certain drugs are invented and they are intending to do one thing, and what they intended to do, they intended to have this great, I think it's how Rogaine was invented. It was like intending to be some kind of heart medication, and it turned out to be this great hair regrowth treatment. If you don't accept that what you set out to do may not happen, then you're never going to set out on that journey. So I think it's accepting that even though you might not have accomplished your goal, in the learning, in the experience of trying new things, or trying to get to this predetermined destination, that you're going to find maybe something else is actually better, and you might fail, or you might have healthcare.gov. The only two options, I guess. I don't know.
I think, to take a step back, one of the things that is different between the way tech approaches projects and the way maybe theater does is this concept of minimum viable product, which I can't remember in the last hour if we've talked about that at all.
Not.
Okay, so Elliot can probably expand on this a little bit better than I can, but essentially, like, what are the base needs of the thing in order to achieve the goal? So, you just built a website, or you just had a client come to you and say, I want the moon, but I have 2 months and $3. And so sort of breaking down what their actual needs are and identifying what is going to get you from point A to point B is big, because I think when we look at the arts, we have a lot of really intelligent and creative people who are throwing a lot of really incredible ideas around, and you very quickly have a scope that creeps and balloons, and eventually it becomes a point where your failure can only be catastrophic, right? So if we can define our projects in that sort of like, what is the one thing that I actually need to get this done, we can make failure more palatable, because we can understand exactly where it went wrong and we can address it next time.
Yeah, totally. I think about that is like identifying what your goals are and what you're attempting to accomplish, what your target is. And I think in the theater world, when we looked at like the products we were making, first of all, I would love to think about what the idea of an MVP is in theater. I just have no idea how that would work.
Actors.
But
just an actor.
Just a stage. But this idea of, we are very thoughtful, I think, in the product world, we try to be. We might think that we're very thoughtful, but we definitely try to be very, very thoughtful about our goals and what we're actually trying to accomplish. And then looking at something and saying, does this help us meet our goal? And I think where we were successful at the public in experimentation was, okay, our goal is to get 10 new people in the door. Our goal is to get media coverage here. Our goal is to get, these very like specific things that were measurable and potentially achievable. And that's how you can kind of gauge whether you're actually doing something or not, or whether you failed or not. And then if you failed because you only got half as many people as you wanted to get, or you didn't get the media coverage. And it's just very easy to understand whether you did something well or you didn't do something as well. And I think the more concrete you are about setting your goals and setting out your trajectory, the process doesn't really matter, but you know that you need to try to aim for some level of achievement.
And if I may, this probably does leak. This probably does go a lot back into agile and that idea of constant communication and collaboration, where perhaps a lot of this failure could be prevented, or you can catch it early, and then maybe it's not so much of a concern anymore. But what would be your take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're constantly communicating out and communicating to other members of your team, it's very easy to identify those points and those places of weakness. I think, again, it's difficult with the healthcare.gov example, which is sort of a really big one that was many points of failure along the chain. It seems like the more recent Iowa caucus, because this is all I can think about right now, Iowa caucus failure might be a good one, since there are like two really tangible examples we can point to there. One, they launched an app for everyone who doesn't remember, because I'm sure this podcast will come out much later than I'm recording it. The Iowa caucus team was planning to use an app to track how many delegates each candidate was receiving in each of the caucus sites. And there was just sort of a spectacular failure. Right, it's tested. It was side-loaded onto phones, meaning it was not easily downloadable from a store on your iPhone. It had to follow a like slightly more tech-savvy route to get on there. And then I think the biggest flag was that the backup plan was to use phone lines, but the phone line number for the backup emergency call in your like number of delegates here, that phone number was exactly the same as, are you having problem with the app? Call this phone number here. So you had your phone line slammed, in addition to these recent reports of, I guess, 4chan maybe had sent a bunch of trolls to also jam that phone line. So there were a lot of points of failure along the way that like really basic communication could have solved, right? Like they could have stress tested it. They could have discussed if the end user was actually going to be able to sideload an app, and they absolutely could have figured out another secure channel of reporting and tallying votes as a part of this sort of emergency plan.
So in terms of anything within arts management that tech can learn from, or anything tech that arts management can learn from, do you have any final words of advice for our listeners?
I think the one thing to remember is that the arts are an extremely insular community, right? Both within your team, within your organization, within your half of the organization, within your audience. When I was at Studio, we participated in a study of all of the theaters in Washington, D.C., and found there was not a whole ton of overlap between audiences. You would think that if you go to the theater, you go to all the theaters, but really audiences in Washington, D.C. went to Shakespeare Theater and then their own local theater, right? So we have formed a series of very insular communities. A lot of flack, and rightly so. There's a lot of things here that are broken. It gets a lot of flack, especially for claiming to be avant-garde and claiming to sort of push the boundaries of things, right? That's sort of the Silicon Valley stereotype. But I do think there's something to that assertion of, if you have an environment that feels truly collaborative, and if you have a space in which you feel comfortable enough to fail, you can actually push yourself to do some real things. So can you go into these arts organizations now and start to break down those bubbles and make those communities bigger and bigger, and take as much as you can and learn as much as you can from other communities?
I guess what I would add to that is, I think kind of what you said, Rachel, in your introduction on the first episode, and that is to be mindful of the things in your work experience that you're looking for. And if those things are not in the art space, be willing to take some time exploring other avenues. I think that the arts and the non-arts profit are made better by spend time in both spaces and understanding how different industries work how different business models work. I think we all too often think that there's one right way to do things, and there really isn't. And I think if anything, if I were to decide that I wanted to go back into the arts, and I've worked on some nonprofit clients or some, art related clients. And I do think sometimes like, oh, I could see myself potentially going back into a space like this. And I feel like I would be so much better informed by how industry works now that I've worked in a for-profit environment. So I think if I had one thing to say to future arts managers, it's that, really consider both sides of the profit coin, because I think your experience is made better by having a broader experience.
I like that. And I agree with that very much. Yeah. I have like a pretty optimistic opinion. But for me, like whenever I hear about these experiences from MAM alums or from lots of people within different fields, including arts management, it's really all about the simple things, like it's those diverse experiences and it's that creative spirit and it's that communication that really makes a product like truly come to its full potential. Again, thank you so much for joining us. It's really been quite a pleasure to speak with the both of you regarding these.
Thank you.
This was awesome. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the Arts Management and Technology Lab podcast series. You can read more on the intersection between the arts and technology at www.amt-lab.org. Or you can listen to more interviews and discussions in our podcast series on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or Stitcher. Thank you for joining us.